Welcome to Zalidated.
Hello, Zostin. Thanks for having me.
How you doing?
I am surviving in this market. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. It is up and down every day. New rumors, new news. Macro is unpredictable as always, but here we are today to talk about what is historically probably the most underlooked field of technology and investment, but is now in the last few years become something that suddenly everyone's talking about, which is privacy, and specifically on-chain privacy. So I want to kind of get into the nitty gritty and get a lot of your views on this, but what first turned you on to privacy as something you were personally interested in?
On a personal level, I've always been interested in the cryptography part of it since I studied cryptography and math in school. And so that always stuck with me. But on a professional or commercial setting, let's say, it was really about, and I'd always been interested in, things like Zcash, Monero. Have been using Signal for many, many years, and I'm a huge VPN nerd, all these different things. But a few years ago, I was in a tech summit, let's call it, and there was some high-ranking crypto people, but also physicists and biotech people and all sorts of really smart people, really. And while doing that, this concept of the separation of money and state came up, and all sorts of other geopolitical events, and it's one of those think tank type things. And me and a few other people, somehow the conversation drifted towards privacy and how a monetary asset must have privacy in order to fully help realize this separation of money and state, but also really anything that crypto wishes to accomplish requires some privacy. And it was interesting that at the time ZK, people were talking about ZK, and it's objectively speaking, if you look at crypto as a technological field, ZK is one of the shining things there that is meaningfully important and can nerd snipe people against something like AI. But it just wasn't necessarily getting attention, and it was somewhat curious why. And so that's when I started looking more into it. Some of the Zcash core devs asked me for thoughts on scaling Zcash, because obviously I'm working on Solana, and so they see Solana as the scaling, let's say, team, and so they wanted some opinions on that. And mixing all these things together, I realized that Zcash was this basically diamond in the dirt, so to speak, where it uses ZK. Not only does it use ZK, it pioneered ZK Snarks as the first production system on the planet. It's obviously necessary. It's extremely slept on, and crypto does not scale to anywhere beyond the niche without it. Not Zcash specifically, but the privacy in blockchains, right? And you look at all the other facets of the internet, and your files obviously are encrypted. Your private messages are encrypted, assuming you're using private messages. And the entire internet runs on cryptography, right? The SSL certificates and all these different things. But the one thing that we are saying is going to revolutionize the financial system is just not making any use of it. And so that seemed to me like the last big, and the word last is a little grandiose, but certainly one of the last biggest important things that are still super challenging, aesthetically pleasing, ideologically important, and still has many thousands of multiples in terms of improvements to make.
Yeah, it's interesting that you phrase it as that, because I think that is a common thread you see from folks in crypto nowadays of I like what I'm doing. I think it's impactful. Is there more that I could be doing? And, there's been some folks I have a lot of respect for who have pivoted out of working on blockchain projects because of that. So yeah, it's kind of nice to hear that for you, it was sort of this idea of crypto is fairly uniquely positioned to be a layer, not layers maybe the wrong term, but to have a layer of privacy or privacy incorporated into it that actually does more than just shield something that already exists, but maybe adds a missing component to what is otherwise a very interesting and very libertarian tech stack.
Right, and
yeah,
even the name, and there's all sorts of different ironies here, but the industry is called crypto, right? After cryptographic money, yet it's not actually leveraging cryptography to do many of the things it should be doing in terms of the financial guarantees that one would assume they get on cryptographic money. But no, it's really just actually transparency. And the reason for transparency is actually mostly a technological, historical reason, because Satoshi wasn't sure how to solve the double spend problem without making sure you can audit all the balances. But now we have the technology. And so it's this fun thing where there's a lot of nerd sniping engineering challenges, but also the ideological part, but also the commercial part, right? Like, it's not totally detached. It actually helps enable markets and money to actually scale on the internet.
Yeah, it's funny. Maybe a good thing to start with would be, and of course you have an engineering background here, even maybe to sort of walk us through a little bit of like, how does the shielded pool on Zcash actually work? Because I think people can get their heads around like, okay, Tornado Cash or something like that. It's a smart contract mixer. It holds a balance confidentially, but fundamentally all of the state is public and verifiable. How does that work when you're dealing with something where the whole layer one now natively supports it, or Monero where the whole thing is sort of encrypted by default? How does one even verify a network that they can't see?
Yes. So one small anal correction there, which is that Monero is not encrypted. It's obfuscated, meaning it uses these things called ring signatures, so that, for example, for one transaction, you add 15 decoy transactions, and so it makes it complex as you keep doing transactions.
It's stochastic privacy. Okay.
Something like this. Yes, it's probabilistic, which is why it's actually a problem, because in the new, let's say, AI paradigm where it can work with unstructured data very well, and as compute gets more and more concentrated and more powerful, that stuff, I'm not super sure it's going to hold up, right? And so you want pure encryption, which, some quantum computers, and we can talk about that later, but maybe to give a general framework of how to think about this privacy stuff, and not necessarily specifically Zcash, but just in general for ZK-based privacy, really what you're doing is you are depositing funds into a protocol, let's say, and then once you do that, you have proof. You have a ZK proof of a commitment that proves that you own some set of things in that pool. Once it's already in that pool, then you can, since you have that proof, you can move it around within that pool and say, hey, I'm not going to reveal what I moved and who I moved it to or where it came from. However, I can prove to you that I have access to these funds. And so please update your cryptography to account for this. And so it's just a bunch of proofs in this. So this is like in the case of Zcash, it's UTXO. On Solana, we're going to do the same thing. And so you're just generating proofs. Now there's other, and like, for example, in Zcash, the data is fully encrypted. So once it's in the shielded pool, the sender, the recipient, the amounts, there is no metadata leaked in terms of, there might be some network thing depending on which wallet you use, but in terms of the monetary properties, none of that is leaked. So that is the strongest way that we know of today of how to do fully private crypto. There's other ways, of course. You can use things like MPC and FHE and trusted execution environments, but the golden standard is really going to be, here's this encrypted data. I can prove to you that I have some access to it. I can prove to you that I didn't double spend because here's a nullifier. And then you give that to something that verifies that. And then once it verifies, it keeps progressing.
Yeah. So you just teased something you're building on Solana, which I very much want to get into. But before we go there, because I'm definitely going to go there, what do you think it was that made Zcash able to have this kind of breakout moment and a renaissance of privacy? Because we've had, for years, people have tried to build and successfully built privacy layers on top of Ethereum, on top of Solana, on top of all these other blockchains. Aztec built an entire L2 on this thesis, and none of them have any users to speak of. Zcash does. Like, you look at the transfer volume, it's pretty high, and yeah, market making, wash trading, but you look at the amount of funds held in a shielded pool, and that's actually been going up pretty steadily over the last few years as well. I would have thought, starting from first principles, selling a privacy token for a privacy chain and getting everyone to move over to it would be much harder than simply bringing privacy to places where people already are. But clearly people are adopting Zcash and Monero at rates that are, not there's no airdrop, there's no farming, there's no incentives for it. What do you think has made these purpose-built privacy chains so successful, and what's been the problems with when people try and add layers to existing public chains?
Yes. So in the case of Zcash, and I would say, I think it's pretty well established, or I don't necessarily care if people disagree, but I think it's fairly obvious that Zcash led the way in terms of this privacy meta, so to speak, and then the others like Monero obviously benefited from it. But the start was Zcash, and there's a few reasons why. One is that, of course, one of the problems with the ZK is that it's super early, and in the early days, especially, it was basically unworkable. The wallet SDKs and the browser integrations and all these different things basically just didn't work. Or even if they did work, it's very computationally heavy, and it was just very, very difficult and clunky experience. And so really, until about 2.5 years ago to 3 years ago, with a trustless ceremony of the Zcash Orchard pool, which is a new one, that started changing. Now it was actually usable. And then what happened is there's a wallet that spun up, a new wallet from the ECC Corp, which is now rebranded to a different name. They used to have a wallet called Zashi, now it's called Zodal. And that wallet really made it super easy to be able to interact with Zcash. Now, alongside that, near intents came, which is to say you can now swap in and out of Zcash cross-chain, no matter what token you hold or what chain you're on, with really just 2 clicks. Okay, so the usability drastically improved there. And then you have a few other kind of macro catalysts, right? So one is obviously that Trump is president, and so privacy-oriented things, if all these different other things are legal, then it seems silly that simply private money would be, this super shaky thing, right? And so it shifted the Overton window.
This was like a real thing. Like, a lot of these privacy-oriented products got delisted from centralized exchanges under the previous administration.
Yes, and that's still the case, really. But I think it's, especially with a friendly SEC and all these different guys, I think it's now sufficiently not de-risked, but I think the perceived risk is much lower than what we had thought before. So that obviously helped play a role. 2 is Bitcoin, obviously, has started disappointing certain types of people, right? As it keeps getting more institutionalized, right? There's the famous Peter Thiel interview where he's like, well, when my friends at the FBI tell me that they'd rather people use Bitcoin than the dollar because of how easy it is to track, then I wonder what's kind of happened to the origination of what this thing was supposed to be. And so people's theses on Bitcoin, especially the early Bitcoin people, or just the people who got into it for the libertarian ideals, started getting disillusioned.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's another one. And then there is also the other factor of most of the coins that have launched in recent history have been not super fairly distributed. And with Zcash, it had launched in 2016, proof of work mined, and distributed over this many years with the holders down only. And so now you have this spontaneous distribution thing that you basically just cannot replicate. It's from a bygone era of crypto. And so you take all these things together, and then there was things like I helped listed on Solana and Hyperliquid and So it started making its way through the crypto spheres of the world. And you put all these things together and you have people talking about it. And obviously the liquidity isn't, super thick or anything, although now it's much different than it was. And then you have the reflexivity of like, okay, especially as, things start getting more draconian in terms of surveillance in Europe and all sorts of different regimes in the world. It's just a set of things that really combined to paint the picture that we have today.
In your view, what about the layer approaches haven't worked?
There's all sorts of reasons why they haven't worked, and I've been trying to write a piece on this, but roughly it's something like this, which is privacy is similar to decentralization in that pursuing it for its own sake is largely ineffective, right? You can say, well, I have this decentralized protocol, so you should use it, and it doesn't do much, right? So, and it's the same as saying I have this privacy protocol, you should use it because privacy is good. That also doesn't do much. It must actually enable something tangible that the user can feel or achieve.
Yeah.
And with the case of Zcash, it's relatively simple because you're not necessarily investing in the blockchain, but the assets. The blockchain is just what enables the assets, right? You can make all sorts of arguments that a truly internet native store of value must have privacy as a non-negotiable, right? Because like if it's trackable, then you've really just created some weird fiat alternative with more surveillance. It's also not truly fungible, right? If in a digital coin, if you have history attached to it, then you can't necessarily swap it for the other, and so the fungibility suffers. There's also sorts of other arguments you can make, like the cypherpunks started Bitcoin, and the cypherpunks entire operating module is that you use privacy for individual choice and sovereignty. And you can point to things like Satoshi in the early forums talking about this, and Hal Finney, and Satoshi even cited Zuko in the first Bitcoin post, right? So with Zcash, because it's more of an asset as opposed to a programmable layer, it's much easier. With a programmable layer, what ends up happening is, again, it's the decentralization thing that I said. You need to give some tangible benefit that the privacy enables. One thing that people are now waking up to is that, ironically, the institutions themselves won't come on chain unless they have some privacy guarantees, right? So while the average retail user might not care, the institutions absolutely care about. And this is why you're seeing things like Canton and even Tempo get some attention these days, because they do help enable privacy for commerce. But yeah, so I mean, in terms of what the others don't understand really is that you must already have something to make private. You can't just have the thing private and then have the things come to it, right? So this is why things like Solana would benefit highly from privacy, because there's already liquidity, there's already trading activity, there's already stable coins, and there's already all these other things. But importantly, Solana also scales, right? So if you have privacy on a layer that doesn't scale, and it's a programmable layer, meaning you're supposed to actually do things with it other than hold or bespoke payments, well, then it needs to have extremely good user experience, right? Because the user doesn't necessarily care what your technical architecture is. They care about the guarantees they get. And so some combination of those has been the shortcoming, and why I think it's super important to add a privacy layer to Solana, because it's going to be scalable. It's going to be at Solana scale, but it's already going to integrate and compose with all the other things that already exist on that chain, right? Versus with a roll-up architecture, you get into all sorts of weird issues that you had with L2s in terms of liquidity fragmentation and interoperability and security guarantees and all these different things that already haunted them before privacy was even introduced.
Yeah. It's interesting. So this is where I want to get into because you've teased a bit, you're building something privacy powered, privacy focused on Solana. Tell us a little bit about that.
Most people on Solana, like Solana native people, probably know about Light Protocol, which is a team that we work with to build generalized compression on Solana. which helps you reduce account creation costs on Solana by orders of magnitude. And so we acquired the team there. What people don't know about them or might have forgotten is that they actually started out as a privacy team on Solana, but then started doing compression stuff. But then now it's come back full circle. And I had this idea where I was trying to think of like, okay, how do we actually enable privacy on Solana without all sorts of these weird compromises of trusted execution environments? And it occurred to me that the way compression works is actually that even though the execution is on Solana, the state you have to accumulate by replaying the ledger, and there's no reason why that state can't be encrypted. And so then I messaged the team and I said, well, actually, have you guys thought about this? And then they were like, actually, yeah, that would work. And so I was like, okay, we should join forces. And and then sometime after that, we have decided we're going to build a privacy protocol on Solana. Haven't decided on the name yet. Might just call it the Solana Privacy Protocol or something just completely obvious. And basically the way it will work is you'll be able to shield your assets similar to a Zcash or something like Railgun or Ethereum perhaps. And you won't have to bridge anywhere, right? Like it'll all be on Solana. So assume you are on your wallet, you click shield. And then what happens is what I mentioned earlier, which is you then generate a ZK proof that you have made a commitment to this shielded system. And then once you're in that system, you can do private swaps, private payments, you can do private borrow and lend, private staking, all sorts of different things that you just could not do before on Solana. And importantly, we really try to minimize the compromises here. So it's fully Solana composable and atomic. The execution is on Solana, right? So there's no off-chain rollup here. It'll be such that, so we have these concepts called zones, which is to say that there'll be one giant consumer zone that is fully permissionless and anybody can do whatever they want. We're going to make it immutable. But then also enterprises can come and plug in to these zones and create their own zone. And they can have their own compliance requirements, deposit limits, withdrawal limits, and all these different things. So you can kind of get the compliance side, but also the cypherpunk side in one giant primitive.
So, I mean, this is like what people have talked about as like the holy grail of this is being able to have private balances, but still having access to things like DeFi. How does that work from this perspective? Because I think there's been a lot of attempts to build these things. And you said a few very important words there about composability and atomic. Everything that I have seen that is trying to do this has failed on those fronts. So like what breakthrough have you and the team at Light made? Is there something about Solana that makes this easier than when folks have tried it in EVM? Like what's the magic that's making this possible now?
Yes, so when we released compression a while ago, that really broke the brains of many people in crypto because they were just not at all familiar with how Solana works, because most of the terminology and frameworks you see in crypto are centered around the shortcomings of the EVM and Ethereum-based systems. And so when you introduce them to something like compression on Solana, where the transactions are on chain and then you're just accumulating the state by replaying the call data, that is not a thing that really, I mean, you can maybe think of it as a based rollup to some extent that's recoverable on chain completely. So there's no great name for it, honestly, but the breakthrough is really that Solana has this interesting trade-off between storage costs and transaction costs. And you can, and Solana has native ZK interoperability, right? You can verify ZK syscalls just on the main runtime. And so you combine all these things and you can get such a system on Solana. Now there is of course trade-offs in the sense that they use a lot of compute units, for example. And these are things that'll improve as we, do some CU golf and help, the core devs benchmark exactly how many CUs things should take. And as Solana scales CUs as well, right? Like they want to get rid of the entire concept. But anyway, so you put all those things together And you use things like Solana's PDA primitives and the fact that you are supposed to compose in Solana, right? That's like the whole idea of the account model. And you'll be able to basically just have your smart contract CPI into this. We've designed it to be composable such that there's a root ZK UTXO program, and then there's many smaller other programs that can kind of call into it. And so, for example, you can build an RFQ system or a swap program or something like this by just CPIing into this.
That's very cool.
Yes.
What's
I mean, it's not live yet, but it will be very cool.
Yeah. What is as you're sort of thinking about this, like one of the challenges in Solana DeFi is everybody ships cool new things. Nobody bothers to integrate them into their protocol. This was the journey through a lot of folks who've like tried to ship new features and get them integrated. How are you guys thinking about, for lack of a better term, like go to market of a privacy protocol?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, one interesting tidbit here is that I didn't actually want to build this at first. At first, I was just angel investing into privacy protocols on Solana in the hopes that somebody would just solve the problems. And I think some of those are still good protocols, and I think they'll solve different types of problems. But it turned into a thing where every week I would get a message from a founder on Solana, and they would ask me, hey, how do I do privacy on Solana? Like, what do I use? And they would tell me the requirements, and I just could not point them to anything that didn't have compromises, right? It would be something like, well, you can use this, oh, but that's confidential, and like confidentiality is not enough for your use case here. Or like, oh, but this thing is not fully on chain, or like, oh, this uses a TE, and like, oh, but you can't do selective compliance here. And so I was going through that, and then I was seeing Canton and the other, corpo chains, so to speak, win these deals, and I was like, okay, this is relatively existential. Yeah, where it must be solved, and it must be solved fast. And so we came up with this design. And so one is that it just solves the problems that people have articulated to me, and then it's going to be on us to obviously communicate how and what are the trade-offs and all these different things. Now, there will be, in terms of go-to-market, not everybody will need it. Not everybody needs privacy. Some people really need privacy, and especially anybody who's doing something like a neobank or some sort of payments like payroll app and things like this will for sure need it. But more importantly, the big enterprise deals simply will not pick Solana unless they have fully configurable privacy for their clients, right? So that's going to be my focus for the first little while, which is going to be the bigger institutions. And then, if people don't integrate it, that's fine. We will build things on top of it and then show what's possible until people want to integrate it, right? So, I mean, we were already talking with a bunch of wallets and DeFi protocols, and so far everybody seems to be quite interested. And we already actually have a few customers lined up who will use it right away. But it's something, and again, like go-to-market isn't a science. You can't top-down plan it. You need to just release the thing and then see how people are engaging with it, steer the design, and then kind of iterate from there. But I think privacy is something that everybody requires, right? And especially on Solana, where we're trying to get institutional legitimacy. We obviously need this. We have a lot of retail and on-chain activity. They obviously need this. But then also even things like that are maybe not thought of too much in this regard, but MEV, right? As soon as you have a completely encrypted swap protocol, you literally cannot get front run. There's literally no information that people can use to attack your trade. Right. And so assuming we're able to get liquidity on these, and we will obviously work with all the big market makers as part of Helius, that would also be quite attractive for some of the people who are, especially as you trade securities on chain, you legally cannot have MEV on those, right? And so if you have tokenized stocks, for example, you would want the trades to be encrypted.
Yeah, this is definitely one of those things that I think a lot of people are maybe a little bit too optimistic about when they're coming into thinking about how securities will actually trade on chain.
Yes.
That you
There's
need
a lot of legislation there.
There's a ton there. There's transfer agent requirements. There's all this debate about, like, obviously MEV is a problem. Can you even have a record transferred on chain? It's kind of interesting because like, you think about privacy as both solving and creating problems here, in that what you really want are private securities transactions, and at the same time, one of the potential problems is that these things are public. And so it's just a very interesting, these things need to be public for auditability. So you mentioned compliance was one component that you guys are thinking of building in. What does that look like? How do you balance the needs of, a potential compliance requirement with sort of the ethos of privacy and the way you've been thinking about this?
Yes. Well, one way to think about this is that privacy isn't secrecy, it is choice. Meaning some people want secrecy, some people want other trade-offs within that spectrum. And so the way we're constructing this is, you can think of them as zones or pockets, meaning Helius will deploy a public zone that has no view keys, any permissions required for it, and it's going to be immutable, and then it'll be just for people to plug into, such as wallets or retail and consumer. However, if you're an enterprise, let's say you are Citibank or something, and you want to have private securities trading or private borrow and lend, well, what you can do is we'll give you the tools to create a zone, which will plug into the privacy primitive, but then within that zone, you can have your own view keys so that your customers, it'll be private between themselves, but then you'll have this audit record for yourself. And that's, by the way, it's a requirement. Like, you literally cannot, can't not have that, and because the feds will come after you. And so, you can have things like withdrawal limits and deposit limits and co-signing requirements and all these different things. And so things that you would be doing off-chain, you can now bring on-chain with the same properties.
And you mentioned this is sort of all built on-chain. We're sitting in a moment where more and more people are at least toying with or sometimes building things off-chain. And this is kind of a moment that Solana, has sort of been trying to figure out, do we take things that are not L2s but maybe a little bit more off-chain, and do we treat them as being on Solana, or do we treat them as not being on Solana? Where do you kind of come down on that? Because I'm sure this is a hell of a lot easier to build as a semi-on-chain product than a fully on-chain product.
Yes, that's completely correct. Well, so if you're not going to use the chain, then it feels to me that you shouldn't, or let me rephrase. There's not that much point in using a blockchain if you're not going to use a blockchain, right? You can certainly do things that are synergistic, so to speak, with a blockchain, and maybe you just use it for the deposits and withdrawals, and maybe for your purposes, for your business requirements, that's all good and fine. But fundamentally, the chain exists for legit reasons, right? So composability is the most obvious one in this case, right? If you don't have composability in globally shared state, and if that state isn't growing over time, well, then liquidity fragments. Well, when liquidity fragments, user experience suffers. Well, then also market concentration, or markets are not as concentrated, which means they don't tell you the information that you expect them to tell you. And you end up basically creating different versions of Web 2 and Web 2.5, so to speak, which aren't all that interesting to me. Certainly you can do them that way today even. And doing it on chain is much more difficult, but there are tangible benefits to doing them on chain. And if we're not going to do that, then I'm not sure why we're here.
So I think you are very well known as the Solana guy and the Solana reply guy. You also have this dual identity as someone who's been a sort of longtime supporter of Zcash and has been instrumental in getting it on people's radar to understand what this thing is. When you sort of look at the future of more privacy moving on to Solana, what do you see as like the long-term value proposition of a Zcash? Or if Zcash looks at building out more smart contract and programmability layers, like how do you, as someone who has historically been like a single protocol maxi, think about this sort of world of more choice when it comes to privacy? Maybe that's a better way to ask that question.
Sure. Well, I would say again that the point of Zcash really is the asset, which is to say the distribution, the story, the social framework around the miners, right? For example, on Solana, something can get sanctioned and then validators have to basically, we've seen similar things on Ethereum where like Tornado Cash gets sanctioned. Yeah. And on Zcash, obviously, the way that would be handled is quite different. But also Zcash is, especially with things like near, composable with all other blockchains. So it doesn't presuppose that Solana must succeed or, one chain must win. It says, look, this is the way to build an internet native store of value asset, and the reflexivity and the story and the compound. And by the way, you must remember that privacy is a network effect, meaning the more people use it, the more private it gets, which means the more people use it, which means the counterparty risk reduces. And so if you have serious money, you're going to want to use the most serious thing. Yeah. Right. And also, like, the privacy is fully vertically integrated in that it's everything from the network level to the miner level to the metadata level. It's completely vertical. Versus on Solana, you can get pretty close, but for the most serious people, you probably will never be able to match that exact level, just because you can't. It's sort of similar to, why don't we just add scale to this blockchain by adding L2s? It's like, you can do that, but there are problems that will arise with it because you're going to have a lot of leaks, right? It's because privacy is actually the absence of something. It's the absence of information leaks. And so unless you build the pipes to minimize leaks to begin with, then there's going to be leaks. And anyway, the easiest answer here is that Zcash is the asset that you're investing in, and then the framework and everything works together to help the asset. And I think there's many cool things you can use it in conjunction with Solana. So for example, obviously we brought Zcash to Solana, but I also want to add light clients between Solana and Zcash, such that, for example, let's say you shield something on Zcash. Okay, well, now that's your collateral that uses credit, and then now you can do payments or some other DeFi activity on Solana, right? And so I think there's some composability there.
Yeah, it does seem like Near Intense was very directionally correct in the idea of like there are ways you can bridge chains while using the native properties of each one. But yeah, it does feel like there's something missing there from like a whole product perspective. So I like that sort of view of the world of like, because bridging is always a mess. But right now, if you want to take out a loan against your BTC on Bitcoin on Solana and use one of the borrow lend protocols, like you can't really do it without moving the funds over. And so that's definitely an interesting view of the world where maybe we're seeing the idea of there being one store of value asset in Bitcoin, and like, sorry, Ethereum, but like ETH was never money. Maybe that's starting to change a little bit.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Ethereum is also now focusing a lot on this privacy stuff, like as an entire ecosystem, actually. The foundation is basically all gas in terms of trying to push privacy across all different protocols and SDKs and all this stuff. And so Solana is really the one that's, and obviously Bitcoin, but that's a given. Right. But Solana is obviously very behind in this regard. And so like there needs to be something to actually, I just don't think that any chain that doesn't have privacy as a first-class citizen is fundamentally going to survive. I mean, even Hyperliquid has I think it's called Silhouette, but even they have already a shielded primitive to help, liquid funds do private trades.
Do you think that means Bitcoin is going to lose its place as a first-class asset? If developers don't somehow figure out a way to add privacy?
I think without privacy, Bitcoin's ceiling is much lower than people think. And I'm not necessarily even the one to say this. You can see all sorts of the different types of liquid funds and big macro type investors like Ray Dalios of the world and Shamas of the world, and all these guys just talk about it all the time, which is well, look, the lack of privacy is actually a huge problem. And I'm not super zero sum in this, in that some people think that Bitcoin must be displaced or something. I don't think so. I mean, I think you can certainly have more than one store of value. I mean, you already sort of have that today with Bitcoin and gold, where gold is by far the most dominant. But especially as things get more digital and, AI and geopolitical instability over the world keeps, every day there's a geopolitical event now and some currency fiasco. I think it seems unlikely to me that there would not be more stores of value that are internet native.
I view that similarly, that it's becoming what felt for a while like this sort of predestined, it will always be, Bitcoin type thing is interesting. I think it's not necessarily the place we thought it would be.
I mean, there's all sorts of reasons that I didn't even talk about, which is obviously people have heard about the quantum risk. And the funny thing about the quantum stuff isn't necessarily that it will happen.
Yeah.
But it's that a store of value asset has to be a low entropy asset, meaning the one thing you don't want from it is a surprise. And so you want to build with a minimization of surprises always as the first priority. And so if you're saying well, it will never happen and it'll take 20 years and all these different things without having a concrete plan, well, then you're exposing your holders to an eventual surprise, which they don't want to think about. The entire point of a store of value is that, okay, I stored the value. That's it. I don't want to be surprised anymore.
Yeah, this is I've been sounding the alarm quietly about this for a while, which is that there's no real concept of a quantum migration plan on Bitcoin today that is any sort of adoption. You either have to do it ahead of time or you have to have a plan ready to go when something does happen. And it's just a real market confidence thing of, to exactly your point, you need to be able to tell people exactly what the plan is before they think about the plan. What you want is the classic, everyone starts tweeting about, is Bitcoin quantum resistance, and someone goes, yeah, here's the paper we wrote 3 years ago, and here's the proposal on how to do it, and here it's almost done, just not activated yet. That's kind of what you want, and that does always seem to unfortunately be a weak point of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Well, Mert, if folks are interested in learning more about what you do, your views on privacy, where they can get involved as a Zcash core developer, where can they find you?
At Mert on X, x.com/@Mert.
It's a good handle.
It is good.
All right. Well, Mert, thank you again for joining us on Validated.
Thanks for having me.